The laughter came before the reading even finished, sharp and careless, the kind that settles in your chest long after the room goes quiet. Hal Brenner sat in the stiff leather chair, his 9-year-old daughter Annie's small hand wrapped around his fingers, as his brother and sister smirked across the polished oak desk. The attorney's voice droned on about bequests and properties, but Hal already knew how this would end. Kenneth had the money, the lakeside cabin, the easy confidence of a man who never doubted his place in the world. Patricia had the antiques, the lawyer's calm, the certainty that life rewarded the sharpest elbows. And Hal? Hal was given $5 and an old mountain shack no one wanted, a structure so forgotten it barely merited a line in the will. The laughter came again when the words were spoken aloud, echoing against wood-paneled walls like a verdict. Hal said nothing. He had learned, through divorce courtrooms and long nights alone, that dignity sometimes meant silence. Annie squeezed his hand harder, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. He forced a small smile, one meant for her alone, even as something old and heavy stirred inside him. That shack had once been his grandfather's refuge, a place of stories and starlight. Whatever his siblings saw as an insult, Hal felt as a summons, though he could not yet explain why. Some inheritances arrive wrapped in gold. Others arrive disguised as loss, waiting to reveal their truth. The drive into the mountains stripped the world down to essentials. Cell service vanished, then the noise, until only the engine's steady hum and Annie's quiet wonder remained. Pines closed in, the road narrowing to a scar of dirt and stone, and Hal felt memory rise with every mile. His grandfather's voice seemed to ride the wind, reminding him that worthwhile things were never easy to reach. When the cabin finally appeared, it looked smaller than Hal remembered, hunched against the rock face like an old man guarding a secret. Boards sagged, shingles were missing, and the porch groaned under their cautious steps. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, sunlight filtering through grimy windows in pale shafts. Annie wandered slowly, reverent, as if she sensed this place mattered. Hal told himself they had come for closure, to see the end of something. Yet his eyes kept scanning the floor, the walls, the corners, guided by a restlessness he couldn't name. When Annie pointed out a loose board, Hal knelt without thinking, prying it up to reveal darkness beneath. A trapdoor lay hidden there, fitted with a small, old combination lock. His heart began to pound. This was no accident of age or rot. This was intention. He remembered his grandfather's pocket watch, the inscription about time and truth, and suddenly the cabin felt less like a ruin and more like a question waiting patiently to be answered. The lock opened with a soft, decisive click, and cool air breathed up from below, carrying the scent of stone and deep earth. Hal lowered himself down the ladder first, every rung a test of faith, while Annie waited above, her voice tight with worry and excitement. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark to reveal a tunnel carved by human hands, supported by timbers placed with care. This was no shallow hiding place. This was history. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a chamber where crates rested against the walls like sentinels. Inside them lay ore shot through with silver veins, tools worn smooth by long use, and a leather-bound journal whose pages whispered of another life. Hal read by flashlight, his breath catching as the words described a prospector's discovery more than a century earlier, a strike so rich it had invited danger. Torn pages hinted at secrets hidden deeper still, promises made to protect more than wealth. Hal climbed back to the surface shaken, his understanding of the inheritance already changing. What his grandfather had left him was not merely property, it was stewardship. Annie listened wide-eyed as Hal explained what he had found, and in her simple certainty he found courage. "Grandpa wouldn't hide something bad," she said. "He'd hide something important." Hal knew then that whatever waited below, he could no longer walk away. Over the following days, the truth unfolded in fragments, each one heavier than the last. A retired geologist confirmed the ore's value, naming numbers that made Hal's head spin, sums that could erase every worry he'd carried since his marriage ended. Yet the journal spoke of more than money. It told of ancient chambers, of artifacts left by people who had known the mountain long before silver ever mattered. In a hidden room sealed behind stone, Hal found proof that his grandfather had spent decades protecting those remnants, documenting them, negotiating quietly with the descendants of those first inhabitants. A letter written in a trembling hand explained everything. This inheritance was never meant to be divided evenly. It was meant to be entrusted. Hal read until his eyes burned, understanding at last why his siblings had been given what could be counted, while he had been given what had to be carried. When Kenneth and Patricia appeared with lawyers and threats, claiming fairness and family, Hal felt fear claw at him. He could not afford a legal war. He could not compete with their resources, but he could honor a promise. Standing in the mountain air, facing the siblings who had laughed at him, Hal found his voice steady. He would not sell. He would not bargain away what was never his to exploit. The mountain, it seemed, was testing him, just as it had tested every man before him. The courtroom battle everyone predicted never unfolded the way Kenneth and Patricia imagined. When representatives of the tribal council stepped forward, armed with documentation and decades of good faith effort, the narrative shifted. This was no longer a squabble over inheritance. It was a matter of honoring agreements, of preserving cultural history, of recognizing that some wealth demanded restraint. Hal watched his siblings, confidence falter as judges listened, as experts testified, as the mountain story finally spoke for itself. The mine would be carefully developed, its proceeds shared in a way that supported preservation and provided security without destruction. The artifacts would return home. The shack would remain, not as a monument to poverty, but as a reminder of patience. Months later, Hal brought Annie back to the cabin. It looked the same from the outside, still weathered, still modest. Inside, though, it felt different, lighter. Annie asked if they were rich now. Hal laughed softly and told her they were safe, which mattered more. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in quiet fire, Hal felt something he hadn't in years: alignment. His grandfather had trusted him not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he knew how to listen. Life settled into a rhythm Hal had once thought impossible. He kept teaching, kept grading papers late into the night, but now he did so without the constant fear of the next bill, the next setback breathing down his neck. The classroom no longer felt like a holding pattern. It felt purposeful again. Annie grew taller and surer of herself, her curiosity sharpening with age, proudly telling friends about the mountain that had quietly reshaped their lives. From time to time, visitors arrived. Scientists with careful hands, historians with notebooks, elders with slow, reverent steps, each entering the cabin as if crossing a threshold rather than a doorway. Watching them, Hal learned that true wealth rarely announces itself loudly. It does not arrive with headlines or applause. It reveals itself through responsibility, through the quiet satisfaction of doing what is right when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. Kenneth and Patricia slowly faded from his daily life, their anger cooling into distance and then into something like irrelevance. Hal wished them well without reopening old wounds, understanding that resentment was too expensive to carry. Standing alone one evening by the cabin, the pocket watch warm in his palm, he finally understood the inscription. Time did not simply reveal truths. It tested whether you were worthy of them. His grandfather's legacy had not turned Hal into someone new. It had uncovered who he had always been, buried beneath disappointment and doubt. The mountain had not given him escape. It had given him purpose. Years later, when Annie asked why Grandpa hadn't just sold everything and lived easy, Hal told her the truth as simply as he could. "Because some things are bigger than comfort," he said, his voice steady. "And some promises don't belong to one lifetime." She nodded, accepting it the way children accept gravity, without argument, without drama, as if it had always been obvious. Watching her walk the familiar path around the cabin, boots crunching on gravel worn smooth by time, Hal felt gratitude rise where resentment once lived. He remembered the laughter at the reading of the will, the sideways looks, the assumption that he had lost. He had been mocked, underestimated, dismissed as the sibling who came away empty-handed. Yet those moments had cleared the path for him to receive something far rarer than money: trust across generations. The mountain stood unchanged, patient as ever, holding stories older than any one family, older even than the silver hidden in its depths. Hal knew that someday Annie would stand where he stood now and choose what to do with this inheritance. He hoped she would remember that worth was not measured in appraisals or contracts, but in the weight of a decision made with integrity. Long after numbers faded, character would remain. In the end, Hal understood that the true gift had never been the silver beneath the stone or the financial security it eventually brought. It was the chance to prove, quietly and without witnesses, that kindness, patience, and respect could outlast greed. Life had offered him a test disguised as an insult, wrapped in laughter and 5 careless dollars, and he had answered not with anger but with care. Standing beneath a sky crowded with stars, the cold mountain air filling his lungs, Hal felt the quiet approval of the man who had trusted him when others laughed. The world would always measure success in loud,